they're addressing him. You see, brother, how many thousands of believers there are among the Jews, and they are all zealous for the law. They have been told about you that you teach all the Jews living among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, and that you tell them not to circumcise their children or observe the customs. What then is to be done? They will certainly hear that you have come. So do what we tell you. We have 4 men who are under a vow. Join these men, go through the rite of purification with them, and pay for the shaving of their heads. Thus all will know that there is nothing in what they have been told about you, but that you yourself observe and guard the law. But as for the Gentiles who have become believers, we have sent a letter with our judgment that they should abstain from what has been sacrificed to idols and from blood and from what is strangled and from fornication. Then Paul took the men, and the next day, having purified himself, he entered the temple with them, making public the completion of the days of purification when the sacrifice would be made for each of them. Acts 21, 20-26. New Revised Standard Version. This passage shows that the early Jewish Christians continued to follow Jewish law, circumcising their sons and keeping the traditions of their fathers. Some of them continued to take the Nazirite vow, as the 4 men whose heads were being shaved here. This Mosaic practice was one of dedicating one. Where did the concept come from? 67. Self to God and following strict rules of purity and sacrifice for a specified length of time. See Numbers 6, 1-21. Gentile converts, on the other hand, often did not follow the same set of rules. It is apparent from the above verses that in the Jerusalem church they only had to abstain from forbidden meats and adultery. Besides differing practices, there were also many different understandings within the early church concerning the true identity of Jesus. In fact, these differences were very marked, and are eloquently expressed by Robert L. Wilkin in The Myth of Christian Beginnings. Doubleday, 1971, pp. 165-166. There were no set beliefs agreed on by all, nor were there any ground rules on how to determine what to say or think or do, nor was there any acknowledged authority for deciding such questions. Let us suppose that in the year AD 35 2 men, Michael and Ephraim, became Christians in Jerusalem. Michael went to the town of Edessa in Syria to live, and Ephraim went to Alexandria in Egypt. On arrival in their respective cities, each told others about the remarkable man Jesus. After telling their friends about Jesus, let us say Michael and Ephraim organized Christian congregations. Almost immediately, problems would arise. What should we do about the Jewish law? What should we do when we gather for worship? The questions were endless, and the Christians in Edessa and the Christians in Alexandria would not answer all in the same way. The traditions Michael and Ephraim brought with them were too embryonic, too undefined, to answer every new question or settle every dispute. They had to make up their own minds as they understood their own situation and the memories they brought with them. Now let us change the scene to AD 75. 40 years have passed. In the meantime the Jews have been defeated by the Romans, and Jerusalem has been destroyed. Also, the Christian movement has spread widely and solidified its traditions. Let us now suppose that someone from Edessa travels to Alexandria and learns that there is a Christian community there. To his surprise, he learns that they have little in common except a common loyalty to Jesus, and the fragments of his words that have been handed on orally. And even the fragments of his sayings are not in quite the form. 68. Development of the Christian doctrine there in Edessa. The visitor from Edessa discovers that the Christians in Alexandria do not keep the Jewish law, whereas his congregation keeps it exactly, admitting no one to the Christian community without circumcision. The Alexandrians pray to Jesus, whereas in Edessa all prayers are addressed solely to God the Father. Both are shocked at the practices and beliefs of the others. Given this great diversity among early Christians, At what point did the doctrine of Jesus's divinity actually develop? And what were the factors contributing to the spread and eventual formalization of this doctrine? Searching for the answers to these questions is especially difficult because there are no known surviving documents from the Mother Church, the original Christian community in Jerusalem. For an extensive discussion of this point, see S. G. F. Brandon's book Jesus and the Zealots, Charles Scribner's Sons, 1967, pp. 148 to 159. We will review his arguments in a few pages. There may possibly be an exception in the Epistle of James. Scholars seem to have varying views as to whether or not this epistle was actually written by James, the half-brother of Jesus, or a contemporary of his, or by someone else at a later time in early Christian history. If James or a contemporary wrote it, then it gives us a small taste of the teachings of the Jerusalem church. In any case, it does appear to have been written by an early Jewish Christian as indicated by the first verse. James, a slave of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes in the dispersion, greetings. James 1:1. New American Bible. Here James addresses the 12 tribes in the dispersion. We see James as a servant of both God and Jesus Christ, whom he calls Lord. The verses of James 4:8-10 show that he also calls God Lord. Where did the concept come from? 69. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you of two minds. Begin to lament, to mourn, to weep. Let your laughter be turned into mourning and your joy into dejection. Humble yourselves before the Lord and he will exalt you. James 4:8-10. New American Bible. Recalling again from our first chapter that the original Greek manuscripts contained no capitalization, it is impossible to know exactly what the title Lord, Lord entailed. In current English, the Lord of the manor is very different from the Lord of the heavens and the earth, and yet both can be referred to with the same word with different capitalization. However, the translators of the Greek manuscripts assigned all capitalization in James and other books of the New Testament, so it reflects their understanding rather than necessarily that of the original manuscripts. It may also be useful at this point to note that the word, rabbi, derives from the Hebrew word meaning my master. Jesus was clearly accepted as a rabbi. In earlier times one's master might also be referred to as one's Lord. This may have added to confusion regarding the crucial title of Lord, Lord. James exhorts his beloved brothers to steadfastness, humbleness, faithfulness, treating everyone well, keeping the law which would have been Mosaic law and good works, among other things. He stresses good works in a very Jewish manner. You believe that God is one, you do well. Even the demons believe, and shudder. Do you want to be shown, you senseless person, that faith without works is barren? Was not our ancestor Abraham justified by works when he offered his son Isaac on the altar? You see that faith was active along with his works. 70. Development of the Christian doctrine and faith was brought to completion by the works. You see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. For just as the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without works is also dead. James 2:19-26. New Revised Standard Version. In the Reluctant Parting. How the New Testament's Jewish Writers Created a Christian Book. Harper San Francisco, 2006, p. 244. Julie Gallenbush, a former Baptist minister who converted to Judaism, provides an interesting comment on James. A very Jewish book, James is practical in its moral instruction and attuned to what we would now call tikkun olam, the mending of a broken world. Martin Luther was correct that James does not show thee Christ in the same sense that Paul's letters do. Instead, it provides guidance for a community shaped by God's gifts of humility and mutual care. James unambiguously substantiates the claim that not only Jesus himself but also his followers were and continued to be Jews. Having had this glimpse of what might possibly be some of the teachings of the Jerusalem church, let us look more closely at the differences that Paul had with other followers of Jesus. Remember that Paul never met Jesus, nor did he study with the original apostles. His knowledge of Jesus and his teachings came mostly through personal inspiration. Chaim Maccoby states the Mythmaker. Harper and Row, 1987, pp. 3-4. Paul claimed that his interpretations were not just his own invention, but had come to him by personal inspiration. He claimed that he had personal acquaintance with the resurrected Jesus, even though he had never met him during his lifetime. Such acquaintance, he claimed, gained through visions and transports, was actually superior to acquaintance with Jesus during his lifetime, when Jesus was much more reticent about his purposes. Paul, however good his motivations, could not pass on to us the exact words or actions of Jesus during the years he taught. Where did the concept come from? 71 on earth. He had no way of knowing exactly what they were. It is inevitable that he would be in some conflict with those who were actually with Jesus during those years. Their experiences and their memories of a flesh and blood man would necessarily be different from the Jesus Paul knew only from his visions. Paul versus the super apostles. There are several indications in Paul's letters that there were powerful and authoritative opponents to his teachings. Paul wrote that these opponents were teaching a gospel other than the gospel you accepted and preaching about another Jesus. I am afraid that as the serpent deceived Eve by its cunning, your thoughts will be led astray from a sincere and pure devotion to Christ. For if someone comes and proclaims another Jesus than the one we proclaimed, or if you receive a different spirit from the one you received, or a different gospel from the one you accepted, you submit to it readily enough. I think that I am not in the least inferior to these super apostles. 2 Corinthians 11, 3-5. New Revised Standard Version. As Paul continues, it is clear that those whom he refers to above as the super apostles are Hebrews whose authority he does not question, but he tries to match their qualifications with his own. Since many boast according to human standards, I will also boast. 2 Corinthians 11, 18. Brandon argues that Paul's super apostles are indeed the original apostles of Jesus. Ibid, pp. 152-153. Paul, curiously, despite his exceeding agitation over their activity, never names them. Whoever they were obviously Christians of great authority or representative of leaders of great 72. Development of the Christian doctrine authority. For they were able to go among Paul's own converts and successfully present a rival interpretation of the faith. Moreover, although he is so profoundly disturbed by their action, Paul never questions their authority as they did his. These facts, taken together with Paul's very evident embarrassment about his relations with the leading apostles at Jerusalem, point irresistibly to one conclusion only, that the other gospel, which opposes Paul's own, was the interpretation of the nature and mission of Jesus propounded by the Jerusalem church, which comprised the original apostles of Jesus and eyewitnesses of his life. Not all biblical scholars agree that the super apostles were the original apostles, and that the different gospel was that of the Jerusalem church, but for some there is a very good case for their being so. In fact, the very name super apostles seems to be evidence. Who else would fit such a name? The passage we quoted earlier from Acts 21, 20-26 demonstrates that the original apostles had differing views from Paul, and they had the authority to enforce those views, at least by writing to the Gentile converts to abstain from what has been sacrificed to idols and from blood and from what is strangled and from fornication. This is important because, as stated before, Paul never met Jesus. He had no first-hand knowledge of Christ's teachings. Yet most of what we know about the very early years of Christianity comes from Paul's letters. And the gospel of Christ that has survived has come through the Pauline tradition. All this means that we do not know for certain what the original followers of Jesus taught. And more importantly, we do not know how much of Jesus' own teaching has reached us unflavored by Paul's understanding and that of his tradition. One thing we do know is that the differences among the early members of the church were deep and divisive. Paul's letter to the Galatians makes that clear. Scathingly, Paul exhorts his readers to stick to the gospel he had delivered to them. Where did the concept come from? 73 I am amazed that you are so quickly forsaking the one who called you by the grace of Christ for a different gospel. But even if we or an angel from heaven should preach to you a gospel other than the one that we preached to you, let that one be accursed. Galatians 1:6-8. New American Bible. Whoever Paul's opponents were, they had authority that Paul felt he needed to counteract. This is shown by the fact that he goes on by defending his own authority, and then attacking those who apparently were preaching a return to Mosaic law. For all who depend on works of the law are under a curse, for it is written, "Cursed be everyone who does not persevere in doing all the things written in the book of the law." And that no one is justified before God by the law is clear, for the one who is righteous by faith will live. Galatians 3:10-11. New American Bible. In fact, the above verse shows that Paul actively fought against those who observed Mosaic law. This is reinforced by the following verses. Once again I testify to every man who lets himself be circumcised that he is obliged to obey the entire law. You who want to be justified by the law have cut yourselves off from Christ, you have fallen away from grace. Galatians 5:3-4. New Revised Standard Version. One of the strongest pieces of evidence that Paul's opponents were the original apostles comes in Galatians 2:6-14, and from those who were supposed to be acknowledged leaders. 74. Development of the Christian doctrine. What they actually were makes no difference to me. God shows no partiality. Those leaders contributed nothing to me. On the contrary, when they saw that I had been entrusted with the gospel for the uncircumcised, and when James and Cephas and John, who were acknowledged pillars, recognized the grace that had been given to me, they gave to Barnabas and me the right hand of fellowship, agreeing that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised. But when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face, because he stood self-condemned, for until certain people came from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles. But after they came, he drew back and kept himself separate for fear of the circumcision faction. And the other Jews joined him in this hypocrisy, so that even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy. But when I saw that they were not acting consistently with the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas before them all, "If you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you compel the Gentiles to live like Jews?" Galatians 2:6-14. New Revised Standard Version. We see here that initially it was James, Cephas and John who recognized Paul's authority. What about the other Jerusalem apostles? Were they the important and prominent ones who wanted Paul to add to his teachings? If not, why were they not mentioned? And what was he supposed to add? It seems logical that these opponents were original apostles, and that they wanted him to preach the following of Mosaic law. The above quote shows that later, in Antioch, even Cephas had a run-in with Paul over the practice of Mosaic law. Paul, where did the concept come from? 75 accuses him and the other Jews of dissembling, and not being straightforward about the truth of the gospel and of wanting to force the Gentiles to accept Mosaic law. If Paul attacked even his own supporters among the Jerusalem apostles, it seems inevitable that he was at odds with them as a group. Given the extremely strong prohibition of idol worship in any form, which is at the core of Mosaic law, it is almost certain that any tendency to deify Jesus would have been strongly resisted by the Jerusalem apostles. This could well have been the basic cause of the rift between Paul and the original apostles. Brandon argues Ibid. p. 154. According to Paul's own testimony, his gospel was repudiated and his authority as apostle was rejected by his opponents. This the leaders of the Jerusalem church could effectively do, because Paul had never been an original disciple of Jesus, nor had he learned the faith from them. However, the irony of the situation, from our point of view, is that it is Paul's gospel that has survived and is known to us from his own writings, whereas the gospel of the Jerusalem Christians can only be reconstructed from what may be inferred from Paul's references to it and what may be culled, also by inference from the Gospels and Acts. This apparent triumph of Paul's version of the faith is surely to be traced to the Jewish overthrow in AD 70. That final sentence is important. Brandon draws a parallel between the esoteric Jewish community at Qumran whose books were hidden before the community was destroyed by the Romans in AD 68. Those documents are now known as the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the community that authored them is known almost solely through them. Fairly recently those very scrolls have been made available to scholars at large, stirring great hopes for a breakthrough in our understanding of Judaism at the time of Christ and thus, early Christian development. Brandon proposes that the Romans also wiped out the Christian community in Jerusalem, which strongly maintained its ties to Judaism, in AD 70. Thus its documents were lost as a consequence of the Jewish uprising there. 76. Development of the Christian doctrine. The annihilation of the Mother Church of Jerusalem meant that the original leaders of Jewish Christianity were killed or dispersed. Also, there must have been a strong political force encouraging the moving away from Judaism and any traditions that identified a community as being tied to Judaism. These factors would have greatly aided in the strengthening and spread of non-Jewish concepts among early Christians. They would have almost certainly helped the spread of the concept of Jesus's deification, especially given the Roman custom of deifying their own leaders. Possible effect of Paul's background. We can only surmise how much of an effect Paul's background had on the development of the Christian doctrine of Jesus as God incarnate. A. N. Wilson in his book Paul, Mind of the Apostle W. W. Norton, 1998, page 26, offers some interesting thoughts on the matter. Paul was born in Tarsus and is often referred to as Paul of Tarsus. Every year Heracles, a Greek divine hero, was honored in Tarsus by great religious ceremonies. Every autumn in Tarsus the boy Paul would have seen the great funeral pyre at which the god was ritually burnt. The central mystery of the ritual was that the withering that of the summer sun had brought the god to his death, but that he would rise to life again in the spring, at about the time when the Jews were celebrating the Passover. From inscriptions in Tarsus we know that Heracles, in his dying and descent into Hades, was regarded as a divine savior. Thus, Heracles, who had one divine parent and one human one, might possibly have served as a model for Paul in his interpretation of Jesus and his life and death. If this was the case, Paul may not even have been conscious of it. It is also possible that Wilson puts too much stress on Paul's birthplace, as in Acts 22. 3. Paul indicates that he was brought up in Jerusalem. Where did the concept come from? 77. I am a Jew, born in Tarsus in Cilicia, but brought up in this city at the feet of Gamaliel, educated strictly according to our ancestral law, being zealous for God, just as all of you are today. Acts 22. 3. New Revised Standard Version. However, the parallels between the Pauline image of Jesus as a divine Son of God, who was Savior to mankind, and her equals may be worth noting. Wilson also mentions that Tarsus was a center of Mithraic worship where initiates drank the blood of a sacrificial bull or a chalice of wine symbolizing it. Ibid. p. 25. This seems reminiscent of the wine of the Eucharist. Prior to the Nicene Councils, for over the first 300 years after the crucifixion, the nature of Jesus and his relationship to God the Father was understood in a variety of manners by different segments of the early church. There were those who believed that Jesus was just a mortal man who had a very special relationship with God. Then there were those who agreed with Theodotus of Byzantium that Jesus was born a mere man and attained the ability to work miracles at the time of his baptism. Some of Theodotus's students later believed that Jesus became God after his resurrection. And then there were those known as monarchians who believed that God and Jesus were one and the same from the beginning of time. Some believed that Jesus was created, and some of those believed that he was fully human but shared his body with the Son of God. Others who believed Jesus to be human believed he was adopted by God. Those whose understanding eventually won out believed that Jesus was fully human and fully God at the same time, as 78. Development of the Christian doctrine exemplified by the traditional doctrine of the Incarnation, as briefly discussed next. Doctrine of Incarnation. The doctrine that was codified and eventually accepted in 325 by the First Council of Nicaea is basically that Jesus Christ was the incarnation of the second person of the Trinity, and was truly God and truly a man at the same time. All other understandings were decreed to be heretical by the conference. We will examine the doctrine of the Trinity in a later chapter. Here we will look just a bit more closely at just a few other views as illustrations of the diversity in early Christian thought. Peter Kirby's excellent website at http://www.earlychristianwritings.com provides much of the following information and quotes on the Docetists and Nestorianism. Last accessed December of 2014. Docetists. Docetism was the view that Jesus was divine and only appeared to be human, and his physical body did not actually exist but was an illusion. In his An Introduction to the New Testament, University of Chicago Press, 1937, p. 318, Reverend Edgar J. Goodspeed writes of the Docetists. They held that his sufferings were only seeming and not real, and hence were known as Docetists or Semists. Their views found expression some years later in the Gospel of Peter, AD 125-50, and in the Acts of John, ca. AD 160. In the Gospel of Peter, Jesus on the cross held his peace, as though he felt no pain. His last cry was, my power, you have forsaken me." In the Acts of John, John says, "Sometimes when I would lay hold of him, I met with a material and solid body, and at other times again when I felt him, the substance was immaterial and as if it existed not at all. His feet left no footprints on the ground." Chapter 93. He seemed sometimes tall, sometimes short. His breast was where did the concept come from? 79. Sometimes hard, sometimes tender. Chapter 89. While he was apparently being crucified down in Jerusalem, John saw him and talked with him in a cave high above the city, and Jesus said to him, "John, unto the multitude down below in Jerusalem I am being crucified, and pierced with lances and reeds, and gall and vinegar are given to me to drink. But I am speaking to you, and listen to what I say." Chapter 97. "Nothing therefore of the things they will say of me have I suffered." Chapter 101. F. Bruce writes Jesus and Christian Origins Outside the New Testament, Eerdmans Publishing County 1974, p. 93. The docetic note in this narrative appears in the statement that Jesus, while being crucified, remained silent, as though he felt no pain, and in the account of his death. It carefully avoids saying that he died, preferring to say that he was taken up, as though he, or at least his soul or spiritual self, was assumed direct from the cross to the presence of God. We shall see an echo of this idea in the Quran. Then the cry of dereliction is reproduced in a form which suggests that, at that moment, his divine power left the bodily shell in which it had taken up temporary residence. In our chapter 9 on the crucifixion, we will find a somewhat similar understanding in the Gnostic Apocalypse of Peter. Arianism. Arius ca. 250 to 336 AD was a presbyter in Alexandria, Egypt, who disagreed with his bishop Alexander. This ongoing dispute appears to have been the main issue that triggered the initial calling of the Nicene Councils. Arius believed that Jesus did not always exist, but was present at it and is thus distinct from God, and subordinate to him. Wikipedia's article Arius http en.wikipedia.org Wiki Arius, accessed December 2, 2014 quotes a report of his arguing that if the Father begat the Son, he that was begotten had a beginning of existence, and from this it is evident that there was a time when the Son was not. It therefore necessarily follows that he the Son had his substance from nothing. 80. Development of the Christian doctrine. It appears that for him this was demonstrated in John 14:28, quoted in the last chapter and again here. If you loved me, you would rejoice that I am going to the Father, because the Father is greater than I. John 14:28. New Revised Standard Version. The First Council of Nicaea declared this belief heretical. Arius was exonerated 10 years later by the Regional Synod of Tyre, only to be declared again to be a heretic almost 50 years after his death. The term Arianism has come to mean those of his teachings that go against the doctrine of the Trinity as determined by the First Council of Nicaea 325 and the Second Council of Nicaea 787. Nestorianism. Nestorius was a patriarch of Constantinople from 428 to 431. Rev. George A. Jackson in his The Post-Nicene Greek Fathers D. Appleton and Company, 1883 tells us that from the few letters and fragments of his writings quoted by others he would seem to have been a thoroughly orthodox believer, yet by publicly rejecting the use of the phrase Mother of God, as applied to the Virgin Mary, he drew upon himself the hatred and anathemas of Cyril, Bishop of Alexandria, who believed in one only nature in Christ,